We've got representatives from different actors within the regulatory ecosystem. We've got Hugh Taylor from the UK Accreditation Service, the External Affairs Director, and will be joined later by the CEO of the UK Accreditation Service, UCAS. We have Keith Sonderling from the EEOC, Commissioner of the EEOC, which is the US Equal Opportunities Commission. Then we're going to have a series of panel questions and then a short break and audience Q&A. So please be thinking about any questions you want to ask the panelists as we go through things. There's a Q&A feature, so you can add your questions on there and we'll come to them towards the end of the session. So why are we all here? We've all seen the amount of initiatives going on in the space of AI, the amount of investment in the 2010s, and now the flurry of initiatives, both regulatory and otherwise. And we're all here because we want to build accountability, trust, and governance into that ecosystem. And that's because of lots of issues that we see that affect society, relating directly from AI and autonomous systems. And a lot of that ties directly into data. I think we need to remember that the reason that we are seeing a lot of progress in the AI space is not algorithms per se. It is the volume of data that's available in the world, the amount of compute power that's available to process that data. And in the short term, a lot of the issues are around personal data and decisions that are being made about people by AI systems. We're starting to see issues of a much more ethical nature. I think this year was the first time that a drone killed someone in combat without a human decision maker in the loop. And we can see lots of long-term issues when we look at AI conceptually and the fourth industrial revolution. The amount of people involved in this ecosystem is also huge. The G7, the OECD, the UN at a supranational level all have initiatives looking at AI and the risks and principles around it. Policymakers, both national, supranational, and even at a local, at a city level, are looking at AI systems and what they need to do. We have accreditation bodies, certification bodies, internal and external audit firms, professional bodies. So professional bodies like in the UK, they're looking at chartered status for things like data scientists and holding them to a code of conduct. We also have various industry-led and not-for-profit-led consortia throughout the sector, like ForHumanity. A few notable things about AI systems and services. I think one of them is, are we regulating systems, services, or processes? That's quite unclear with AI systems, whether we're certifying it, regulating it, even if we're just verifying and validating it. The difference between the product and the system can be quite different compared to traditional products or physical products or virtual products. We also have an extraterritoriality. Oh, can I say that word? Extraterritoriality issue. There are laws, data privacy laws, that affect people outside of the jurisdiction that law is passed in. And that's an issue notably around GDPR, but will obviously have a big impact in terms of international trade and other matters when it comes to AI systems. Another issue is the transdisciplinary nature of AI. It is not enough simply to be a data scientist. We need ethicists, philosophers, developers, testers. There's all sorts of different lawyers. There's all sorts of different professions involved in this emerging and nascent ecosystem. So that's my sort of opening thoughts. In terms of who I am, I'm not a regulator and I'm not a policymaker. I work a lot as a practitioner and also in standards. So I work with the European standards body, the international standards bodies, in terms of the sort of topics that we're going to be edging on today. Okay, so enough about me. Let's move on to an introduction from one of our panelists. Keith, would you like to introduce yourself and go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. I appreciate the introduction, Adam, and everything ForHumanity is doing in this very important space. So I'm going to talk about, from my perspective as commissioner on the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, so I'll be focused more on the labor and employment side and AI use in all aspects of HR, and tell you a little bit about what's going on in the United States with executive orders and otherwise, and interest from Capitol Hill. So when I was nominated to the EEOC just 2 years ago, the notion that artificial intelligence would become a mainstay of HR departments seemed closer to science fiction than reality for most Americans. So fast forward to
right.
2020.
Hi, it's Paul. Does it get through?
Yes.
We can hear you.
We can hear you. Issue
All right.
resolved. Great.
We got those technical difficulties. Okay. So I will continue now. So fast forward to 2021, and the pandemic has transformed the way we work, accelerating the rate at which employers have adopted AI-based HR technologies. 86% of major US corporations now predict that AI will become a mainstream technology at their company this year. And 83% of HR leaders report relying on some form of technology in employment decision-making. This turn to AI-driven HR technologies did not happen overnight. AI has been involved in making decisions in every stage of the job life cycles for years. So it recruits and hires, it evaluates and promotes, it identifies candidates for reskilling and upskilling, and it even terminates employees. It writes job descriptions, screens resumes, and conducts job interviews. It identifies employees' current skills and potential skills, tracks productivity, and assesses workers. And if employees fall short of an employer's expectation, an AI algorithm may send them a message saying you're fired. In short, AI is now making nearly all the sorts of decisions once made by HR personnel. Carefully designed and properly used, I believe that AI has the potential to advance diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace by mitigating the risk of unlawful discrimination. Numerous studies have shown the ways that employment decisions are vulnerable to bias on the part of hiring professionals. For example, one study showed that hiring managers are more likely to favor resumes featuring male names over female names, even though the resumes are otherwise identical. Another study showed that African Americans and Asian Americans who whiten their resumes by deleting references to their race receive more callbacks than identical applicants that include racial references. Oftentimes, HR executives do not become aware of discriminatory conduct by their staff until it is too late. But AI can help eliminate bias from the earliest stages of the hiring process. For example, an AI-enabled resume screening program can be taught to disregard variables that have no bearing on job performance, such as an applicant's name. An applicant's name may signal correctly or incorrectly variables that usually have nothing to do with the applicant's job qualifications, such as the applicant's sex, national origin, religion, or race. At the same time, AI that is poorly designed and carelessly implemented can discriminate on a scale and magnitude far greater than any HR professional. That's because the predictions AI makes about specific applicants are only as sound as the training data on which the algorithms rely. For example, an algorithm that relies solely on the characteristics of a company's current workforce to model the attributes of the ideal job applicant may unintentionally replicate status quo. If the current workforce is made up of one race, gender, or age group, the algorithm may automatically screen out applicants who do not share those characteristics. Case in point, employing this metric, a resume screening company found that the most likely predictors of success at one particular firm were being named Jared and having played high school lacrosse. So when something like that happens, it's little wonder then that the regulation of AI is generating bipartisan interest in Washington, D.C. In the last 2 years, artificial intelligence has become a cornerstone of national technology policy. On February 11th, 2019, then President Trump issued an executive order calling for the creation of a coordinated federal strategy, the American AI Initiative, to be developed through the National Science and Technology Council. Among the initiative's guiding principles are the need to train current and future generations of American workers in the skills needed to develop and apply AI technologies, the need to foster public trust and confidence in AI technologies, and the obligation to develop and apply AI in a manner consistent with civil liberties, privacy, and American values. In a second executive order, then President Trump reaffirmed his administration's commitment to encouraging innovation in AI and promoting the use of AI in a manner consistent with our values as a nation. To that end, the executive order enumerated principles to guide the use of AI in government. First and foremost, which being that federal agencies should utilize AI where appropriate to improve government operations and services in a manner that fosters public trust, builds confidence in AI, and remains consistent with all applicable laws, including those related to privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. Among the other principles to guide the federal government's use of AI are accuracy, reliability, security, responsibility, traceability, transparency, and accountability. One of the last things President Trump did while he was in office was establish the National AI Initiative Office pursuant to the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act of 2020. The law was passed as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. So what that did is it expanded the American AI Initiative previously established by executive order. So acting through the initiative, the president must provide sustained, consistent, and coordinated support for AI research and development through grants, cooperative agreements, and access to data and computing resources. Notably, the initiative must support interdisciplinary research, including the fields of law and ethics, to ensure that AI develops responsibly. The law also created the National Artificial Intelligence Research Institutes for the purposes of promoting cross-cutting research into AI. And it requires the Director of National Institute of Standards and Technology to support research and development into the best practices and voluntary standards for trustworthy AI systems. This includes standards for auditing mechanisms and benchmarks for accuracy, transparency, and verifiability. In fact, just over 2 months ago, NIST issued a draft proposal for identifying bias within artificial intelligence. Working with the AI community, NIST identified several technical characteristics essential to cultivating trust in AI systems. They are accuracy, explainability, privacy, reliability, robustness, safety and security, and mitigation of bias. The draft proposes an approach for identifying bias at the 3 stages of the life cycle: the pre-design stage, the design and development stage, and the deployment stage and post-deployment stage. Although it addressed primarily to the scientific community, the document promises to shape the discourse on AI development for years to come. The Trump administration set an ambitious agenda for the responsible and ethical development of AI. And although President Biden has withdrawn a number of his predecessors' executive orders, the ones concerning artificial intelligence remain in place. There are strong signs that President Biden will continue down the path charted by his predecessor. Notably, he has kept Dr. Lynn Parker, a pioneer in the fields of robotics and AI, in her position as the Director of National AI Initiative Office. And if early signs are any indication, it seems the Biden administration will likewise seek to develop, improve, promote, and implement AI technologies in a manner consistent with civil liberties and civil rights. Just days after being sworn into office, President Biden signed an executive memorandum establishing a government task force responsible for identifying opportunities to address gaps in scientific integrity policies related to emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning. And in June, the White House formed the National AI Research Task Force pursuant to the National Defense Authorization Act. The implication of emerging technologies for equal protections and anti-discrimination law have also generated bipartisan interest in Capitol Hill, where then Senator Harris was a leading voice on the issue. One commentator declared the vice president is good news for artificial intelligence fairness. In September of 2018, Harris was part of a bipartisan team that co-sponsored the AI and Government Bill of 2018. The bill would have established the Emerging Technology Policy Lab within GSA to advise the federal government on the use of AI. Only a week earlier, then Senator Harris signed on to a letter to the EEOC expressing concern that the use of AI algorithms could perpetuate gender, racial, age, and other biases in violations of the laws we enforce here. Together with Senators Elizabeth Warren and Patty Murray, who now chairs the Senate Help Committee that oversees the EEOC, Harris sent a letter to the EEOC expressing that such disparities in AI could encode and magnify gender, racial, and other biases that exist in our society, and which the EEOC is working so hard to combat. And last year, a group of senators sent a similar letter to the EEOC asking for clarification of the Commission's authority to investigate and regulate instances of algorithmic bias. The senators sent those letters to my agency for good reason. It is the EEOC's mission to prevent and remedy unlawful employment discrimination and advance equal opportunity for all in the workplace. Many of the laws we enforce predate by over half a century the AI technologies that is being used now in HR. But our statutes are as applicable to employers who use AI to make employment decisions as they are to employers who rely exclusively on HR professionals. By way of reference, the EEOC enforces the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, the Equal Pay Act, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. These laws protect a job applicant or an employee from discrimination based upon a person's race, color, religion, sex, pregnancy, national origin, age, disability, or genetic information. Our laws apply to all types of work situations, including hiring, firing, promotion, trainings, wages, benefits, and prevents harassment and retaliation. In short, they apply to every type of employment decisions that employers are now using AI to make. Outside the realm of science fiction, AI has no motives or intentions of its own. AI only has algorithms that enable it to correlate data and make predictions. And since I've already told you about the algorithm that predicted that a workforce of lacrosse playing Jareds would be optimal, it should not be too difficult to imagine how an algorithm could predict an optimal workforce of members of one race, sex, or national origin. Workplace discrimination imposes heavy human, social, and financial costs, but employers and employees are not alone as they navigate the promise and perils of AI technology, nor for that matter are data scientists, HR professionals, ethicists, and policymakers. I'm here to support everyone in this undertaking. The EEOC is a law enforcement agency, but I believe enforcement alone will never be sufficient to achieve our mission. Preventing employment discrimination from occurring in the first place is preferable to remedying the consequences of discrimination. It has been my experience that most employers want to do the right thing. They just need the tools to comply. I have found this to be uniquely true in the AI space. Many of the stakeholders from whom I've been hearing from believe in their algorithms and in their potential to promote equality of opportunity in the workplace. I've encountered a community of employee advocates, engineers, scientists, entrepreneurs, ethicists, lawyers, and employers determined to get this right. They are willing to discuss their methods and designs, and they are seeking guidance in this area to ensure that bad actors do not discredit the entire industry. The EEOC, employee advocates, and employers should all welcome this interest. As an attorney who has dedicated my career to labor and employment, I want to see AI reach its full potential in the workplace. As a public servant, I am committed to ensuring that AI helps eliminate rather than exacerbate discrimination in the workplace. And as an EEOC commissioner, I'm committed to providing the clarity that workers, employers, data scientists, ethicists, and policymakers have long been asking for. We cannot fully realize the potential of AI technologies for the American people and for the global economy unless those technologies are applied in a manner consistent with our laws and our values. I stand ready to help our innovators and employers do precisely that and encourage you all to work with me on this worthy enterprise. Share your concerns and let me know how I can help as I work to ensure that AI helps promote inclusion and helps minimize discrimination in the workplace. Thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to participating in this panel and answering your questions.
Thank you. I think there's a really good use case in there around bias in employment making decisions, because whatever regulations or accreditations or certifications need to be in place, they also need to consider that potential upside of removing the cognitive bias from users of systems or people making decisions without AI. And I think that's maybe something we can come back to a little bit later in this session. So, Paul, can I come to you next? Can you give an introduction to how you sit within the ecosystem of AI and regulation?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much for the opportunity to have this great discussion also across the Atlantic. And I must say I was fascinated by the presentation of Commissioner Sonderling and the concreteness of his presentation. Let me say that in the European Union, I think the starting point of principle is absolutely the same, namely that we want AI to function fully in line with our rule of law, meaning secondary law, like data protection law, GDPR, and also the very big key of EU secondary law on non-discrimination. But we also want to see, and I think probably Commissioner Sonderling would agree on that, we want to see that AI is developed by design from the outset, also in line with the constitutional principles, there should be systems which don't undermine democracy and which respect all fundamental rights and civil liberties. And discrimination, of course, is one of the most important in this, but it's not the only one. And we do believe that very many practical steps, all have been mentioned by Commissioner Sonderling, are important in this. Of course, we need to have advice and good academic discussions. But we also believe that this principle that AI should function according to the law is based on the principle of the primacy of democracy, and that primacy of democracy is expressed through binding laws. And that's why the European Commission has put on the table a draft regulation to set out principles for how AI should be developed and how it comes on the market. And I would like to go through with you through this proposal just to give you a taste of where we are going now. This is a proposal from the beginning of this year. It is now being negotiated in the European Parliament and in the Council of Ministers. We are very close to both legislative bodies, and as you know, in Europe, both bodies have to agree by majority to legislative proposals of the commissions, are very close to having adopted their positions. And so I'm confident that at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year, we will see these rules in place. What are they regulating, and why is this legislative proposal on the table beyond the great principle of the primacy of democracy being expressed through binding law, which has democratic legitimacy and which can be enforced? Because in AI systems, we face complexities, opacity, unpredictability. We face a degree of autonomy in the learning of these programs, which has great upsides, but also risks. And of course, we face the combination of these new algorithms with big data, and therefore all the issues which we address in Europe through the General Data Protection Regulation also pertain to AI. And it is very clear that whenever AI processes personal data of people, meaning data which either identifies an individual directly or makes it possible to identify an individual, then GDPR is applicable. The purpose of our regulation is to address safety risks, fundamental rights risks, to make enforcement of the rules possible towards the producers and users in terms of companies using AI. We want to address legal uncertainties, and this is very important in the common market of Europe. We want to avoid that our 27 member states start putting in place separate rules, thus a fragmentation of the market comes into play. But we want to maintain the internal market with one set of rules. And I just use the opportunity to make it clear that, of course, this unity of law in Europe is of particular interest also to American companies, which we are, of course, very open to for operations. They benefit when they are very big in AI and digital economy. We have a lot of very big American companies. They benefit often most from the unity of law in Europe, because that means they don't have to comply with 27 regulatory regimes, but just with one. So this level playing field issue that our rules apply across 27 member states, and of course are also equally applied to companies which have their establishment and their main seat in Europe, as well as to companies which provide services or export goods into the European market, is also very important. And we hope through the legislation, we address also mistrust and fears related to artificial intelligence. It's very important in many issues of technological process that we take people with us, and in the opinion polls, which we look at, by the way, both in Europe and the United States, we see among people more or less similar attitudes when it comes to the use of personal data. To make it short, people don't want to be snooped on, neither by the government nor by big corporations. And also people don't want to be controlled in their lives by machines. So the subjectivity of people means that people, humans, should not be subject to machine control. There must always be at least a possibility of appeal to human decision making, because otherwise, we're turning the world on its head. Technology is a tool for humans, and humans should not be a tool for technology. So that is the background. The scope of what we define as AI is very broad. The regulation sets out an overall broad definition, namely a software that is developed with one or more techniques which are listed and can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, generate outputs such as content, predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing the environment they interact with. And the list of technique and approaches which we then add for legal certainty, they include traditional symbolic AI, machine learning, as well as hybrid systems. The key of the regulation is its risk-based approach, a pyramid of 4 groups of risks. So the biggest group at the bottom is what we would consider AI with minimal or no risk, which is permitted without any restrictions. So this is typically the scope for self-regulation and ethics to play a role of orienting engineers, but no further intervention by law. Then we have a second, smaller group, which is AI with certain amounts of risks where we have some transparency obligations, for example, related to bots. And then we come into the high risk AI. High risk, of course, now being defined not only against the classic technological risk, which is safety, but as we said initially, high risks also of compliance with all existing secondary and primary law. And in this group, we find recruitment AI, medical devices, and so on. And this is where we will have a compliance system through ex-ante conformity assessment of the AI program. And finally, we also set out some red lines of unacceptable risks, and there are a number of very limited examples, and it's actually a closed list. It's not examples, it's a closed list of unacceptable risks in AI. And one example from this list is social scoring by government, as we now see it in China. This is certainly something we don't want to see, and we just straightforwardly forbid in this regulation. Now, most AI systems in our assessment will not be high risks. So they will have to comply with a minimum of transparency obligations. And the most important obligation here is that humans need to know that they're interacting with an AI system. So either it is evident that your communication partner in terms of spoken language or written language, or for that matter, in gaming and so on, is AI, or you must be notified, you must be informed. And this is part of human dignity and also self-determination. Humans must know when they're interacting with machines. And the closer we get to the democratic process, for example, in the run-up to elections, the more important this principle becomes. Because just imagine a world in which we wouldn't know that we're interacting not with a human, but AI. And, we would have these discussions and exchanges of messages on Facebook and or movies on YouTube, or messages on Twitter or Instagram in the political context. And we would think, gee, everybody supports this great candidate, and it's all produced by AI. So, in this way, democracy cannot work. So here we have a clear democracy sensitivity. People must know when they're interacting with AI. People must also know when emotional recognition or biometric categorization systems are applied to them. And that's also very, very important in the area of non-discrimination and recruitment. We cannot have it that people without their knowledge are being subject to automated emotional recognition or biometric categorization. And of course, as a general rule, also impersonation, deep fakes, they may exist for reason of free speech and as a parody or joke or what have you, but they must be labeled as such. So moving on in the area of high risk, we believe that in our law, at least, we have the opportunity to make use of the many rules we have for regulated products, like medical devices, machinery, and so on. And whenever AI is part of such a regulated product and it becomes a safety component of this product, then it falls automatically into this high risk group, and it will have to comply with the specific rules of this product-related regulation and with the rules of the AI regulation for high risk. And the other group of high-risk AI systems is enumerated in the regulation. And what falls under it, and I give you the most important parts of the list: biometric identification and categorization of natural persons, management and operation of critical infrastructures, education and vocational training, employment and workers management, access to self-employment, so, employment platforms, crowdsourcing and all these things, access to and enjoyment of essential private services and public services and benefits, law enforcement, migration, asylum and border control management, and the administration of justice and democratic process. So what does this mean now for producers when they are working under this regulation, and also for the users, namely the commercial users or government users of AI? First, they have to determine whether an AI system is classified as high risk. And so that means they basically have to carry out an analysis of their system against the AI regulation and a risk assessment. They must ensure that design and development and quality management systems are in compliance with the AI regulation and all the principles Commissioner Sonderling mentioned in terms of ethics in the American system. We also had a high-level group on AI ethics in the European Commission until 1.5 years ago. We have absolutely the same principles in terms of reliability and in terms of non-bias and in terms of transparency and so on. All this must be complied with. And there is a conformity assessment procedure aimed at assessing and documenting compliance. This documenting both of the risk assessment and of the compliance process, namely also understanding how the risks which may have been identified are mitigated. This is very important, this documentation. It's both important for process among engineers and producers and users, because it makes people aware of their responsibility, and it also is important for enforcement afterwards, because obviously these rules will have to be enforced, and there will also be sanctions for non-compliance. The legislative proposal does not foresee a third-party verification. This is the classic tradition in our marking system, the CE marking system of compliance with rules. It's a self-assessment, a controlled self-assessment in terms of companies having to document that they comply with the law. Often they will take on special advice for this. Part of the political discussion now is whether that is sufficient, or whether some groups of AI, after all, will have to go from the outset through a third-party assessment. So as I said, I don't want to repeat all these obligations for operators, quality management, technical documentation, logging obligations to enable to monitor the operation of the high-risk system. So you have to follow the system also when it is on the market, like you follow your medicine or your medical devices, and to see how it really develops in the market and whether it continues complying, including through its mutations and learning processes. And there are in the regulation, of course, certain classic duties to collaborate with market surveillance authorities. We differentiate a little bit between the providers, namely the producers of AI, and the users in terms of the commercial users or government users. On the users, there are a number of specific obligations, like, have to follow the instructions of use. Obviously, they have to ensure human oversight of the functioning of the AI system. They must themselves monitor the operations for possible risks. And they have to work together with the providers and distributors when there are incidents and malfunctioning. And of course, they also have to ensure that they continue to comply with existing legal obligations. And I mentioned that in particular where AI processes personal data, GDPR will be key for compliance. And at this moment, I would just like to mention that GDPR also contains specific transparency rules in the context of automated processing. People under GDPR have the right to understand how their data is processed, for what purpose, with which methods. So my reading, and I was the lead director of bringing in GDPR in the European Union, took me 6 years of my life in the Commission working on this. My reading is that these provisions relating specifically to automated processing and automated decision-making in terms of transparency go very, very far. They give people the right to understand and to be explained the algorithm, how it works and what relevance it has for the decision which concerns them. And they also, of course, have a right under GDPR to get reasons for the decision which has been taken relating to them when it has legal relevance. And of course, they also have the right to object to automated processing and require human decision-making as part of our view of human dignity. This is very important. People should never be subjects or objects of machine control. So I don't want to now go through all the industrial policy parts and the institutional setup around this regulation. Obviously, the European Union, like the United States, generally we're very positive of new technology. We have just seen many of the COVID vaccines coming out of Europe, and AI in parts certainly was useful, but also many other skills were necessary in this. So Europe is certainly a technology leader in many fields. And we have all the positive things and all the potentials, upside potentials of AI. We see them, I think, not different from the US. And we have, of course, also major industrial policy strategies in terms of research and development, in terms of supporting uptake of AI, but also in terms of getting our people ready, continuous education, training, investment at universities, but also to accompany the structural change AI brings to labor distribution across the European Union. It is clear that where major efficiencies of AI occur and people lose their jobs, they must be accompanied into new opportunities. All this is part of the strategy, the digital strategy of the European Union and member states. But at the core is not only the industrial strategy, but and let's say warm words on ethics and so on, but a system of which makes sure that also in the technical age, the rule of law actually functions and democracy plays its role in shaping how people live and how technology relates to them and how they relate to technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was very interesting. I've got some specific questions for you that I'll come to during the panel chat about the AI Act, and not so much the regulation, but everything else that has to fall into place around it to make that a reality, and also the relationship to GDPR. But let's go to Farahnaaz next. Farahnaaz, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Farahnaaz Khakoo-Mausel. I'm an assistant director with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And for those of you who may not be familiar with GAO, we are a legislative branch agency in the U.S. government. We provide Congress, federal agencies, as well as the public with key, timely, nonpartisan information on federal programming. And more recently, I'm going to actually focus my comments on a product that we just released in the end of June, the AI Accountability Framework. And I will provide a brief overview of the framework, but before I do so, I'm going to actually put the product number in the chat for those of you who are interested and want to pull up the product as I talk about it. When we began developing the AI Accountability Framework, we really wanted to understand the landscape. And what we quickly understood was that there were a lot of principles. For Commissioner Sonderling and Paul's comments, our OECD partners in the U.S. government through executive orders, there was a lot of guidance and aspirational goals around what AI should be. AI should be ethical, AI should be accountable, AI should be responsible. But we hadn't reached a stage in terms of how to operationalize those concepts. And the framework that we've developed really is a practitioner's, auditor's, third-party assessor's guide to auditing AI systems. And that's really the angle by which we developed it. We also initiated our work by convening an expert panel of academics, industry experts, nonprofits, inspector IGs, federal agencies, and we pulled everyone in a room together, a virtual room. This was September of 2020. And we talked about what factors should we consider when we're thinking about auditing and third-party assessments of AI. The US government last year was budgeted to invest over $1 billion in its non-defense budget for AI. If we just park the defense budget, which I think is probably 5 to 10 times that amount. So definitely the US government is moving forward. So what should we be thinking about as auditors and third-party assessors? What criteria exists in the landscape right now? What artifacts and evidence, assessment methods should we be considering? And then last but not least, this notion of bias. How should we assess and think about bias, and how can we think about it from a methods and scope perspective? And this expert panel really was informative, one, in identifying some gaps, but really in terms of what some of those solutions and mitigation strategies should be. And we include an appendix in our AI framework of that discussion around these 5 different areas and topics. So where we landed was we realized that if we were going to develop a framework on AI, we really needed the language to be auditing friendly. The landscape of AI, the complexities and the opaqueness of AI systems already create some challenges in the public sector. So the evaluators, the third-party assessors often come from a non-technical background, but we'll need to have some sense of how to approach these systems. So we wanted to use really language that was comfortable in the auditing community, the notion of governance, data reliability, performance management, and continuous monitoring. And these are the 4 principles that you will see in our framework. And for each principle, we disaggregated at 2 levels. We wanted to be at the organizational, the macro level. So when we're talking about governance, we're talking at the agency, the institutional level, in terms of establishing clear roles and responsibilities, clear goals and objectives for the system, ensuring the workforce skills and expertise are appropriate for evaluating AI systems. And then we also wanted to take it down to the system level, that the data scientist community needed to think about technical specifications and documenting them. When they're identifying their variables and the attributes and the characteristics, that those are actually documented for a third-party assessor. So for each principle, what you will notice is a 2-level disaggregation to further kind of tease out the concepts. Next, in terms of the organization of the product, again, with a very audit focus, we have practices that we want implementers, practitioners, auditors to look at. We have key questions that the third-party assessors really need to think about when they're approaching auditing these the AI, but then thinking about that principle. And then the last is the specific audit procedures that need to be taken. And when we pulled this product together, we definitely did a very thorough literature review in the sense of we looked at our international partners, we collaborated with OECD, our colleagues in Singapore, in Canada, in the EU, have a lot of great specified focused frameworks that were in place when we developed our framework. And we really tried our best to kind of incorporate those practices because we didn't want to conflict. We didn't want our auditors to kind of have this very view of, well, there's this frame sitting here and now GAO is presenting an alternate frame. So we really tried to kind of pull together as many practices as we could. Now, the framework is not use case specific. We're not talking about specifically autonomous vehicles or cybersecurity or criminal justice or law enforcement use of facial recognition. The framework is very broad intentionally because we wanted to provide a very aggregate macro look, some foundational principles that federal implementers and practitioners need to take into account. And then in a phase 2, we envision more of a use case application, a case study approach of if we were looking at autonomous vehicles or we were looking at Department of Transportation and its applications, their AI solutions, how would we approach the framework from that perspective? So with that, I'm just going to do a quick deep dive. I did want to kind of echo some of the comments the commissioner made and Paul made in this notion of the community of stakeholders that are really that need to be involved in auditing AI systems. And we consider them, we talk about them as community of stakeholders. We're not just talking about the data scientist community, the designing community, the engineers. We're talking about policy experts, domain experts. We're talking about risk management officials. We're talking about advocacy groups. And we're talking about users. And we have this really cool graphic that we have in the product to kind of lay out this group of community of stakeholders that need to be involved throughout the AI lifecycle. And similarly, we propose a AI lifecycle, which actually what we'd like to say borrowed from our OECD colleagues who laid an AI lifecycle out very well from the design, development, deployment, and the continuous monitoring of the AI solution in the system. And so throughout this life cycle, you need to engage all of these different partners because when we interviewed our data scientist and designer community, their training, what they noted, this notion of ethics, the notion of diversity and inclusion, that's not what data scientists are trained on. Data scientists are trained on precision, accuracy, recall. They want their probabilistic algorithm to be as precise as possible. Is the data representative? Are the technical specifications documented? Is it the notions of bias and ethics addressed? Are our civil liberty issues factored in? Those are aspects that data scientists and designers are not trained on. And so we have to make sure that that's what the baseline is. And so this community, this broad community of stakeholders that we talk about in the AI framework is really key. And we were intentional. In every practice under our audit procedures, we have interviewing, and we wanted to be clear on who you should consider interviewing when you're thinking about this specific practice and the group and the community of stakeholders that should be involved. And it's really an extensive list, but it is a list for auditors and third-party assessors to keep in mind. So I'm already seeing some questions about this notion of ethics. And if you actually search the product, you will not see the term ethics maybe more than once. And that was intentional as well, because we did not, the notion of ethics, I think in all of our government spaces could be operationalized and defined in very different ways. If we had a whole conversation right now about your ethics versus mine, that line of what is the threshold will vary. So instead, we're using very auditing terms. So we're using terms like representativeness. We're using terms like, is it appropriate? We're using terms like responsible, which you can operationalize as auditors. We didn't want to get stuck on terms that auditors would have to then figure out on their own, well, what does this really mean? we are addressing the notion of ethics, but we're just addressing it with different terminology, and that was intentional as well. So with that, I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of the framework, and then I'm more than happy to have a conversation. Like I said, we recently just released it. June 30th was our release date. So we've been on a roadshow. Myself and our chief data scientist, Taka Ariga, who led this effort in communicating and really ensuring that this framework is used by all partners. The audience of this framework is very broad intentionally. We had practitioners, we had federal managers, supervisors, we had auditors, evaluators, third-party assessors, and our vendors in mind. What we're quick learning, at least in the US concept, is it's more of a 50-50. The US government is in the bucket of developing AI solutions and systems on their own, from design to deployment, but they're also doing a lot of third-party procurement, off-the-shelf models. And for those third-party procurement, it's really important in the notion of transparency and access to the data that was actually used during the training phase, and discussions and documentation of the data that will be used in the operational phase. That's really key. And so we had our third-party procurers, the private sector, in mind when we developed these practices, just in terms of their awareness of where the US government is. So in terms of governance here, which was our first pillar, not necessarily sequential in nature, but definitely some foundational principles that we wanted to highlight. The notion of clear goals and objectives. It's really important, and this is when we spoke to the data science community, that really right now, the solutions are more of a function of data available. If there's massive data out there, there are AI solutions out there. And that's not really the approach that governments want to take. We really want the AI solution to be solving a problem that the government has. And it has to be more problem solution oriented. So the notion of clear goals and objectives and what the desired results of the model are really need to be established and clearly document for third-party assessors. Roles and responsibilities in terms of oversight, the authority, the delegation of authority of who says stop to the model. Once the solution is operational, if it's not working, who has the authority to stop the model? Who has the authority to say, okay, the system is not achieving its result, or the system is inherently has some bias? Who has that role? And that really needs to be clearly identified from the federal side. And then the notion of stakeholders. Internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders. We really wanted to be clear that you needed a group of people at the table for efficient and effective implementation of AI systems. It cannot be done in a vacuum. And then the next practice that we highlight, which is really key, and I think it's a fundamental gap, I think, in the US government right now that we're working on, is workforce skill sets. Do we have the capacity? Do we have the right people, not only developing the systems, but those that will oversee and manage those systems? Do we have those skill sets? And who are we attracting, and are we retaining those staff with professional development? So that was really key at the organizational level when we're thinking about governance. At the systems level, system level governance looks very differently. And we have an innovation lab housed within GAO in our science and technology assessments team. And we're very fortunate. We have a great cadre of data scientists who have an audit focused mind, but understand the technical issues around AI solutions. And we're able to help us develop some practices, which are really, I would say from a simple term, around documentation. That the technical specifications need to be documented, that the system itself is compliant with legal laws, regulations, and that is a checklist from a data scientist perspective, that they do need to be aware of issues that are very use case specific and very domain specific regulatory legislative requirements for the system, and that needs to be met. And so that's pretty much at a high level our bucket of governance. When we talked about data, we considered data really, again, at two levels: model development and then operational. And at the model development phase, we wanted to, from a third-party assessment, wanted to know that there was clear documentation on the sources and the origins of the data. Often when evaluators and third-party assessments, when we will come to audit these systems, we will not be able to rerun the developmental cycle. That's not how AI solutions work. So what we will have to do is really look at documentation. And if it doesn't exist, it's very difficult to ensure third-party assessment and any kind of third-party review of the system. So the initial phase of model development really needs key documentation around sources and origins, as well as the attributes, the variables, the labeling methods that were used. All of that really needs to not only be documented, but then assessed for its appropriateness. And this is the bucket that we really want, where it's like our trigger for the notion of bias, that in a very early stage, this notion of appropriateness needs to be factored in for our designers community. And then the second level is data used at the operational environment. And that is a really big distinction we want to make. Training and validating and testing the model versus the model being operational and using, for instance, federal agency data really are two different levels. And the level of completeness, the notion of bias, reliability really needs to be checked at both levels. And we wanted to be very clear, and we wanted to kind of raise this notion that practitioners needed to really assess the interconnectedness and the dependencies of the data streams, and the notion of potential biases here during the data ingestion phase really needed to be assessed. The next pillar is around performance, and this was really interesting. When we convened our group of experts, this is prior to developing the model, performance was probably the biggest gap. When we spoke to experts, it wasn't clear, or maybe there was a bit of disagreement on what performance should look like for AI systems and how we should assess. And here, I guess maybe we had the two camps, right? We had the camps of the engineers, the scientists, the developers who said, look, we were trained on precision. We want these models to be precise. It's our p-values, that we really care about at the end of the day, versus the policy wing of our expert panel said, no, for us, is it really achieving the intended goals and objectives? Is it solving the problem that we wanted the solution to solve? Is it achieving its desired results? So we really needed to kind of bridge those two groups together. And our performance pillar, again, is disaggregated at two levels. At the component level, where we need to focus on this notion of cataloging model and non-model components, and then at the systems level, when the components are integrated. And we needed to assess performance, and here, performance is really defined very clearly in the sense that are the results consistent with the program's goals and objectives. So in the absence of program goals and objectives, measuring performance is very challenging. And that's why governance is really key, is that partners, be it federal or non-federal, really need to be clear on what the objective of the system is. And then developing metrics and assessing against those metrics and ensuring the parameters are well documented and established, both at the component at the system level, was really key. Now, at the performance level, this notion of bias again needs to be addressed, because the human in the loop, right? The human now that is kind of supervising the system can also introduce bias at the performance stage, and that also needs to be accounted for. So it can't just happen at data ingestion, it needs to happen again at performance testing. And then the last pillar the AI accountability framework has is around monitoring, which is really key when we're thinking about AI systems, but it's not monitoring the way auditors and third-party assessors, the way you and I have been trained, this notion of static monitoring, right? Well, okay, once a year or maybe once every 5 years, we will monitor, or we will produce an audit report on some kind of a program or a software development tool of sorts. AI, just conceptually, right, with the notion of drift and the data evolving itself, that will not work. So the notion of continuous monitoring is key. And the parameters that are acceptable for the implementer in terms of drift have to be documented, thought about. And so the monitoring pillar is really disaggregated at two levels, this notion of continuous monitoring of performance. And then the second, assessing sustainment and expanded use. So the model worked in one specific condition. Can we apply it somewhere else? And I'm going to keep it very simple for our US audience. A model that worked in California using demographic data from California, can we apply that to Florida? Will it work? Is it appropriate? Will it be reliable? Can we scale it up nationally? Those types of questions we really wanted to make sure were addressed before we, it's really easy for us, and it's not an AI issue, it's more of a program working, right? If a software system or some sort of a development works in one area, we want to scale it up. But I think with AI, we really wanted to stress some cautionary, mechanisms to kind of put a pause on that. And then definitely the stopgap. After performance, if we note that the system is not producing its desired results, or it has harmful results in place, unintentional bias has been introduced, who is responsible for stopping the model? Who is responsible? Does that individual have the power and the delegation of authority to say stop? And so that's pretty much our 4-pillar approach. In terms of just how the framework is organized, we didn't want to just introduce practices, so we wanted to make it easy. I have to be honest, it's a 112-page document. But with that said, we have these one-pager kind of cheat sheets for all of the practices under each of the 4 pillars. It's at the front of the document. If you just downloaded and printed out those key practice, those 4 pages, you have the framework. Past the 4 pages, what we have is we do a deep dive for each principle. And it's more of a how-to. We wanted the audience to be aware of, where did our criteria come from governance? What was the backdrop? And here, our government auditing standards, our internal controls, you will find, are often the criteria that we used to develop these 4 principles. But we wanted a more of a deeper discussion, so you'll see a narrative section for each practice. And then at the end, you'll see the framework itself, which is organized, like I said, in a 3-column matrix. You have the practice, you have the audit questions to consider, and then you have audit procedures. So they're basically 3 components to the whole framework. And in the back, in our appendix, we also include a really nice discussion of our panel meeting that we had with a group of experts. And that also provides some really useful information from a regulation perspective, from a standards perspective. And our colleagues at NIST also participated in the expert panel, some of their viewpoints in terms of criteria development. So really look forward to answering any questions you may have about the framework and connecting with the panel.
Thank you, Farahnaaz. That was great. I look forward to reading it. And I particularly noted a few points there around people and skills. I think I had a conversation with a business in the UK just in the last few days that is worried about the AI Act that Paul was describing, and was asking me if their data scientists could deal with it. And I spent quite a lot of time explaining why it's a much wider problem from both a process and a skills perspective. And my other thought is, certainly there's a big disruption in the skills and labour market at the moment, and it's going to be very interesting to see what those companies do that buy AI systems, but then want to ensure that they comply. Doing the technical work to ensure that they're compliant, when the reason they don't have data scientists, that's why they bought a system. So there's going to be some really interesting things, I think, developing around skills and I guess the private sector side of things like conformity assessment. Okay, I think if we can go to you, Hugh. I am just adding your slides to the stream. There we go, welcome.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you very much. So my name's Hugh Taylor. I am from the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. You'll have seen that the heading there on the first slide says Accreditation and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, because the program that we're undertaking is looking across all the Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies, although obviously AI is probably by far the most common and the one that's embedded in them all. But firstly, I'd just like to thank my fellow panelists, because normally when you're the last to speak, everybody else steals the things you were going to say. But in this case, they've all laid the ground perfectly for the area that I want to come on to, and Farahnaaz particularly in talking about third-party assessment and auditing. So if you go to the next slide, please. So a little bit about who we are and what we do. As I said, we are the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. We are appointed by government in the UK as the national accreditation body. We work with all government departments, but we particularly work and have a memorandum of understanding with our business department, which is the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And again, I think that industrial strategy bit is is relevant, because this is more than just technology. This is a much wider sort of strategic area that we're dealing with. Most countries have a single national accreditation body that operates with the certification organisations within that country. But I should also say that we have mutual recognition agreements between all the official national accreditation bodies through international cooperation forums. So a certificate that is ultimately overseen by UCAS would be acceptable in Singapore, and a certificate originated in Singapore with the Singapore accreditation body logo on it would be accepted in the USA, etc., etc. So part of the purpose of having this international network of accreditation bodies is to help facilitate international trade and create that level of trust that something that has been certified or tested in one country can be accepted in another. So the role of an accreditation body is to accredit the bodies who issue the certification, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Regarding ourselves, we've been around since 1995 in our current format, but a lot of the organisations that were brought together to make up UCAS had been in existence for well over 50 years before that. And because of that length of history, we are probably one of the foremost accreditation bodies in the world due to our size, the scope of activities that we're involved in, and the length of time. And quite frankly, in the last couple of decades, we've spent a lot of time sharing our knowledge with counterparts around the world as to how we've done it, because we've probably been at it longer than most people. If you could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the important thing to say, I think, first of all, bearing in mind this panel of regulators, we are not a regulator. Many of the areas that we cover are voluntary standards, perhaps. They may be driven by commercial competitive advantage. So, for instance, standards like ISO 9001 for quality management systems, or maybe more relevantly, ISO 27001 for information security. Those, by and large, are voluntary standards that companies can choose to aim for, and they go to a certification body and achieve that standard. Having said that, an awful lot of the work we do is in regulated areas, but only where the regulator calls us in to help. So, for instance, we work with a lot of the main UK regulators, such as the Food Standards Agency, the Environment Agency, Health and Safety Executive, the Information Commissioner's Office, where they have decided to utilise the existing international framework and international standards that apply to accreditation and certification and testing. Interestingly, I did note in preparing for this presentation that our Information Commissioner's Office doesn't even call itself a regulator, although effectively that's what they are. They refer to themselves as an independent authority to uphold information rights in the public interest. So I think what we describe as a regulator is probably quite a broad category anyway. I think the other important thing to say about accreditation organisations is that we don't set standards. We don't write the ISO standards, we don't write more local sets of rules, perhaps with government departments. We may contribute to those, but we're only one of a number of stakeholders who would put in a view as to what we think is the appropriate set of rules or how they should be implemented. So very much we rely on standards or frameworks or sets of rules that have been developed by others, and we make sure that they are adhered to. But we would only work with a standard, whatever that looks like, if it has been developed in the right way, and it's not been written by one small section of industry for that section of industry. It needs to have what I would call 360-degree input from all the stakeholders who are affected by that, and I think Farahnaaz sort of touched on that in her talk just now. So perhaps if we move to the next slide, please. What do we mean by accreditation? These are definitions that I've taken from the ISO, the International Standards Organization website. And if we start with certification, that is the provision by an independent body of written assurance, usually a certificate, that the product, service or system in question meets specific requirements. And then what we mean by accreditation is the formal recognition by an independent body, in our case UCAS, generally known as an accreditation body, that a certification body operates according to international standards. So accreditation is the higher level that then approves certification bodies who in turn approve products or systems or services. And I'm making this point because the words accreditation, certification, approval, they do get sort of bandied around quite loosely, but in our world they have quite specific meanings, and as I say are defined in the ISO standard documents. Next slide, please. So some of the areas that we are working on, and this is by no means a complete list that's relevant to the topic of this conference. We've already heard from Paul Nemitz about GDPR. So in the UK, that is overseen by our Information Commissioner's Office. They have a memorandum of understanding with UCAS that we will oversee certification bodies who are looking at GDPR systems. We've also quite recently in the UK, we've been developing, or the ICO, Information Commissioner's Office, has been developing work on digital identity trust framework. Again, I think we're all aware of how much more things are moving online, but you need to be able to prove your identity, that you are who you say you are, and so having reliable online methods to do that are really important, and ICO are working with us to develop those for the UK. In other areas, we're working with the UK Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which is the main government department looking after issues around AI. So we're working with them on Internet of Things, and very much, again, going back to Paul Nemitz's presentation, with a similar categorization for different levels of risk that will apply in different situations. We're working with our Department of Transport on drones. You may be aware that nearly 3 years ago, the UK's second biggest airport, Gatwick Airport, was disrupted for nearly 2 days by malicious drone activity. That resulted in 1,000 flights being cancelled or diverted and 140,000 travellers being affected. So it just gives you a little bit of an idea of the scale of what can happen, what can go wrong. And I think it's also worth noting that what we see very often is that regulation often comes from an event happening. Something goes wrong and someone says we need to do something about it. So previously, there was relatively light regulation around drones, and that has been proved not to be sufficient. So the sort of things that our Department for Transport are now looking at are geofencing to try and ring fence certain areas around airports, for instance, or other critical facilities where drone flights will not be allowed. And then finally, and this is a well-established area, things like information security standards such as ISO 27001. If we move on to the next slide, please. So all of this is very exciting and very interesting, but for us as an accreditation body and for the certification bodies that we work with, it throws up a whole load of issues that we need to think about in a completely new and different way. And again, Farahnaaz has touched on some of this in her talk. The traditional skills that auditors have are not going to be appropriate in the virtual world as we go forward. The accreditation is designed to provide accountability and trust. But the big question that we're now facing up to is how can certification bodies check in a virtual world? How can accreditation bodies check those certification bodies in a virtual world? So much is going to be happening in algorithms. Are companies going to share their algorithms with us? I doubt it. I don't expect that to happen any more than Coca-Cola is going to share its secret recipe with somebody who comes along and says, I want to audit what you're doing. So we have to find different ways of doing that. and perhaps focusing on the inputs and the outputs and recognizing that what happens in between is something that we're never really going to be able to examine in detail. And not only that, the bit that happens in between may be constantly changing because of machine learning, a constant dynamic change, the drift that Farahnaaz has referred to. So how do we move from the traditional way of doing things that we do an audit on a particular day and record what we find into a world where things are constantly changing and what you look at in 1 nanosecond may have changed in the next nanosecond? And does that matter anymore? Do we move into much more of a constant monitoring situation? There's also the question of who will set the standards. Is it going to be the national government? Is it going to be governments across the world working in coordination, industry groups, standards bodies such as ISO, etc.? What we would really love to see is good engagement between all of these interested parties. And at UCAS, we've been running a series of roundtables in recent months with stakeholders from across government, across industry, experts in AI technologies, and trying to gain that, get those organizations together to share their knowledge and recognize that we all need to address these problems. I was thinking back the other day, it's, when automobiles first started appearing 120 years ago, everyone was sort of fascinated and involved in the technology and making them reliable and how does the engine work. We weren't thinking at that stage of speed limits or highway codes of conduct or safety standards for annual checks on vehicles. All of these things tend to come later. But maybe, just maybe, in this situation, we can try and move some of that thinking up front so that we are creating the frameworks at an early stage to help the emerging technologies develop into. So if you were hoping that I was going to give some kind of silver bullet to all of these problems in this presentation, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed, because right now it's a very interesting situation, but we probably have more questions than answers. But I think we're certainly getting there. And then I think the final point I would make, and it's sort of a bit of an elephant in the room, there is a real difficult tightrope to walk here between the need to have regulation and frameworks to prevent the Wild West happening and keep things on track. But how do we do that without stifling innovation? The pace of change in these technologies is incredibly rapid. Historically, standards makers and regulation makers don't move in an incredibly rapid way. So, we want to, I think we would all agree it's necessary to have some kind of framework, some kind of regulation. But equally, if we don't provide it in the right way that is flexible and that can evolve and develop, we will move far too slowly for the technologies, and they will go off and do their own thing, or they will just go off and the Wild West will get even worse. So that's a big issue that I think all of us have to try and face up to. We can't spend forever sitting in committee rooms discussing this. We have to come up with quick, flexible, practical solutions. Okay, that's all I've got to say. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Hugh, very interesting. I don't think any of us have any silver bullets. However much time we've all invested in some of these topics, I think there's still a lot that's not clear. So I'm aware we've been on the phone a long time. I know Paul has to drop off at 4. So there's a couple of questions that I just wanted to direct at you, Paul, about your presentation. And then we'll take a short 10-minute break, and then we'll get into the rest of the questions. Paul, one of the first questions I wanted to ask all of you is, what do you think are the key gaps in existing regulation? But as you said yourself, GDPR covers a lot around AI. And in fact, many of the use cases listed in the EU proposed AI Act relate to personal data. But yet we've never really seen much, or I've never seen much enforcement of GDPR being used against AI systems that are inaccurate, biased, or not robust. Can you sort of explain why you think the new act is needed, given we have those obligations already within GDPR?
Well, there are two answers. So first, AI also using non-personal data can have huge impacts on society and on individuals. And second, GDPR has the purpose to protect privacy and individual self-determination at the center. But there are, of course, other fundamental rights and other objectives which need to be, let's say, protected, and where the protection needs to be concretized in the technical age. And so that is the purpose of the AI Act. But it is very good to ask the question, is there really a gap in the law? And we have, of course, no intention to make law, on issues which was already covered. Let me also say that in the European Union, we have a good experience with what we call technology neutral law. And that is law which is open enough and which uses this advantage of human language, that it is addressed to humans who can think themselves. And so if we open up the language and allow for reinterpretation of this language, as technology evolves and as business model evolves, the law is not slower than technology. It is actually much faster and also much more useful. The best law which we have are the constitutions, which are often 100 or 200 years old and are still very relevant law. And I think in this age of technology, we have to avoid falling in the trap of thinking that a good law is only a law which is written, like a code and can be applied quasi-automatically. I would say the contrary is true. Code is written for stupids. Who are the stupids? The stupids are the computers who can't think themselves. And so they can't reinterpret. And if there's a problem with the code, it needs to be rewritten. And that's why all the 8 weeks we get an update of the code on our mobile phone. But the language of democracy in law has the great advantage that it's addressed not to stupids. It's addressed to humans who have learned to reinterpret it in context. Our judges, our academics, our administrative authorities are able to do this. And I think when we write law also for the technical age, we have to be conscious of this and make best use of it, rather than falling into the engineering view of the world trap of saying a good law is only a law which can be applied by automated systems.
Great, thanks for that. I think it is, I for one note the way that the Act has been written at a high level for that reason, but also I welcome that it relies upon harmonized standards and has a mechanism for harmonized standards to be adopted and recognized within the law. One concern I have is that those harmonized standards won't be ready or are unlikely to be ready when the law takes effect. So it feels to me, and I don't know if you agree, and I don't know if this is by intent, but I think for the first year or two of the law being in effect, we're going to be watching a lot of court decisions unfold, a lot of enforcement action to really flesh out what best practices are in some of these areas. Would you agree with that?
I don't think that everything needs to be contentious, and therefore I'm not so sure that, on everything which is unclear, we immediately need a court action. There will very often be common ground found between enforcers and those concerned. And so we will have a lot of consensual development of things. But it is also true that, some of the big companies in Europe and also America have the unfortunate habit of going on everything into litigation until last instance. And that is often done to intimidate the regulator. And, we shouldn't be intimidated by this. It's important that regulators do their job and don't fear litigation. But, on GDPR, only very, very few cases go to litigation. There's a lot of routine enforcement activity, which, of course, doesn't make the press because it's nothing, it's the normality. And in the attention economy, only bad news is the good news. Only when there's conflict, it becomes a big headline. So, I wouldn't say that in terms of how the law functions, that there is a huge systemic change. It is absolutely okay to start developing standards, and that this is being done in parallel already. There are many actors on this, on standard setting. And in the end, of course, it will be important that the standards are fully in line with the law. And they may have to change over time as technology evolves, but the law doesn't need to change.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to get the other panelists' views on what you think are the key gaps in existing regulation, and your answer might be none. I think, Keith, can I start with you?
Yeah, absolutely, and that is, my answer, at least concerning labor and employment law. Even though our laws were designed in the 1960s, they are as applicable to AI, HR technologies, very much in our space. I know there's a much broader conversation when AI is being used in other areas, but as far as labor and employment law, the laws from the 1960s are very applicable to AI, and I don't think we need new laws. We just need to apply the longstanding laws on the books to this new technology, and that's something I want to certainly do. And I think it's important that everyone understand the employees who are being subject to the AI technology, the employers who are buying and using this technology, and for the vendors who are creating this technology. They all need just an additional, I don't want to say a refresher, but they need to know from the EEOC, who regulates in this area, of how these existing laws apply to this new technology. Without getting too far down the rabbit hole of labor and employment law, Title VII, which covers most of the areas we enforce here, either there's two theories. There's the disparate treatment, which is just the intentional discrimination, or disparate impact, which is the a facially neutral policy that, as applied, discriminates. But for either one of those, AI is applicable to them, whether you're intentionally using an algorithm to discriminate, or you're creating an algorithm that is completely for the right reason to try to prevent discrimination, and it actually discriminates based upon the data it's being fed to in some of the examples you've heard. Either way, those existing laws from the 1960s on, has accounted for that. And I think from our job here at the EEOC, it's just to apply those in all the different scenarios. Like I said, AI is being used in all sorts of labor in HR, whether it's from creating job descriptions on the front end, to interviewing, to terminating employees. And I think for me, what the key is not the gaps, it's here's how it applies in every single step based on these existing laws. And that's something, I want to do, and I'm going to continue to move forward on.
Great. And Farahnaaz, would you agree with that, or do you have a different view?
Yeah, no, I would. I think there is consensus in the community. When we convened the expert group of panels from industry to nonprofits to academics, they all agreed that you don't necessarily need new laws for governing AI, that existing legislation exists. The key here, and we actually have two very specific practices in the AI framework. One around that the developers and the data scientist community need to ensure in their technical specifications that they're meeting existing legislation and requirements. And then from the policy perspective, from a governance perspective, policy experts need to ensure that the system, the solution, is meeting those existing legislative requirements. And to Paul's point, so I fully agree. And I think right now in the US context, there is legislation, proposed legislation out there in terms of governing and ensuring accountability of AI. But again, I think the tone of the legislation is not necessarily to create new laws, but just to ensure that those accountability measures are in place, and that agencies, the federal agencies and federal partners, as well as these third-party vendors, are fully aware of, civil rights issues, labor and employment issues, and that they will be measured and held to accountable from a legal perspective to those measures. So we would agree.
Great. And Hugh, I suppose regulation isn't directly applicable to UCAS, but if I ask the question a different way, what do you think the gaps are in technical standards that you can accredit bodies to certify against?
The work we've been doing this year, one of the things that has come out loud and clear in talking to our stakeholders, I think, is we probably need to spend a lot more time trying to validate the data that is used. I mentioned inputs and outputs, and I think as previous speakers have just said, the laws we probably have are okay, they are right, and you measure the outputs against those laws, and I think there's probably not a lot needs to change there. But we probably need to spend a lot more time thinking about, is the data going in the first place correct? And again, as Farahnaaz mentioned, if you've got millions of data points, it's relatively easy. If you've got a very small data source, then the potential for getting completely the wrong answer is huge. So I think that's an area that certainly I hadn't thought of that much until we started holding a series of roundtables this year and listening to various people, and suddenly trying to validate and be comfortable with the data becomes much more important than perhaps it has been in the past.
Great. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break now. We'll be back in 10 minutes and start going through audience questions. During the break, there'll be a video played of Ryan Carrier, our Executive Director, talking to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on AI in the UK. So if you want to stay in front of your screen, you can do that and be entertained. See you in 10 minutes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Paul.
So it's an honor to represent. We are a public nonprofit. We have over 390 contributors from 45 countries around the world, and we are an unfunded, mission-driven entity focused on examining and analyzing downside risk associated with AI and autonomous systems, and where we can to build in mitigations. And there's a lot of ways to execute that, but our primary focus is on building an infrastructure of trust through independent audit of AI systems. And that is our explicit recommendation for the UK, and to fit into the UK national strategy, is to pull together a replication of independent audit from the financial sector, but in the areas of ethics, bias, privacy, trust, and cybersecurity. That holistic look at AIs and autonomous systems. And that's the process that we're executing currently. We're doing that in conjunction with the ICO and UCAS already, plugging into a replica of the same system where we have auditors who are independent, where we have pre-audit advisors who are helping to build that compliance. And the role that ForHumanity aims to play in the equation is to craft the rules. And so as an example of what we're already doing with the ICO is we've taken UK GDPR and we've taken the Children's Code, which is a gold standard. It's an amazing law that the rest of the world needs to know about. One of the weaknesses of the new EU regulation proposals was they were really light on the children's side of things, when you're sitting here with this amazing law on age-appropriate design code, the children's code. And so what we've done is we've crafted those into auditable criteria. Auditable means they are binary. So an auditor who is liable for false compliance, and this is where public trust is built. When an auditor sits there with no upside potential, auditing all of these rules, ethics, bias, privacy, trust, and cybersecurity, that exist in a binary fashion, compliant or not compliant, measurable, unambiguous, implementable. When that auditor is set up in the right way, with no upside potential, truly independent, wearing downside risk for false liability, or for false assurance of compliance, then what happens is when that audit is conducted over a known and public criteria, approved by regulators, approved by the government, we act as kind of a secretariat that kind of craft these rules and submit them to the government, submit them to the regulator and say, are these the right rules, right? Does this represent what the lawmakers, what the democratically elected legislature intends? Once those rules are crafted, then when an audit is conducted in a truly independent fashion, the public, who these audits are done for, then they trust that compliance is true, because there's no reason for an auditor to say that there's compliance when there is not compliance, because in fact they wear liability. It is a proxy for society, and it is massively important to building this infrastructure of trust. The role we offer ourselves as a service provider to the government to craft these rules in this auditable fashion, and to also train auditors. We are already in the process. We have 200 people who are being trained or have been trained on the UK GDPR audit criteria. As soon as the ICO approves the scheme, which we're working through with them, then we will issue an examination, and these people will become the world's first AI auditors. And that is how the UK can lead. By providing this infrastructure of trust across all AIs, all autonomous systems that impact humans, building out this criteria. And here's the key thing, the key hope and dream from ForHumanity. We did this in 1973. We took industry agreed rules, audit rules, accounting rules, and finance, but then they were mandated. Audits were mandated. That is the main recommendation I would make here, which is that we mandate for all AIs, all autonomous systems that impact humans, that they go through these certification audits. Because when they do, massive amounts of trust will be built, similar to what's been built in the financial industry through financial accounting. I could go on for days. I won't. I will stop there, and hopefully it creates good discussion.
Ryan, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely great, and I'm hopeful that the government will heed your pleas. Tim.
Really interesting, Ryan. And I'm assuming by audit you sort of cover off the impact assessment aspect and the continuous monitoring. So the use of the word audit is a kind of umbrella term for sort of audit at the beginning and then on a continuous basis. But are you putting yourself forward as the organization certifying auditors or setting standards for auditors? Because I think the distinction is quite an important one.
No, the role we aim to play is so we would describe the taxonomy in this way. There's auditors, targets of evaluation, pre-audit, service providers. If you're pre-audit, you can't be audit. If you're audit, you can't be pre-audit. This is the law of independence. But the one thing that neither of these two groups can do is craft the rules. We aim to craft the rules on behalf of humans built into the rules. However, we have no power, no authority, and we don't want any. What we want to do is be able to work with governments and regulators and say, here's the rules. Are we good? And you can say, nope, go back and do the work, which the ICO has done. We got feedback from the ICO in these two schemes. They said, you got to make some changes. We're working on that. We're going to come back and we're going to say, are you good? And eventually they're going to say, yep, we're good. And then we're going to step back and we're going to work with UCAS. UCAS will accredit all qualified auditors to provide these certifications. We will license this scheme to every qualified entity on the planet. They have to be qualified, and what that means is they have to be trained in how to do the certification scheme. That's the role we would aim to play. There's a document I posted in the chat called Roles and Responsibilities that lays out all of these features: UCAS, ICO, government, auditors, pre-audit service providers, highlights all these details.
That's great, Ron. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. What I would say is actually what we're talking about is recognizing what's happening in these systems. As they're being built, designed to decommission, engineers who are trained to solve problems are going from here to there to build the solutions. The mistake that we're making is that throughout this process, they're making instances of ethical choice that they are wholly unqualified to make. Completely unqualified, not trained, no background. They make these choices and it implies an ethos. And so what we do through the audit process is extract these instances of ethical choice, and we put them where they belong, with a trained ethics committee who are responsible, plugged in, standing, and accountable directly to CEOs to evaluate key questions. We are building amazing laws, but some of these laws are so gentle and delicate and nuanced, like the well-being of the child in the Children's Code. And you can't rely on an engineer who's not trained to evaluate the well-being of the child to make those decisions. You need people who are trained at the ethics committee to operate on, are we balancing the well-being of the child vis-a-vis the interests of the entity? So building in ethics committees that are accountable, responsible, well-trained, with great expertise will go a long way when it's required, when it's mandated, when it's compulsory, and when it's audited and checked and reviewed. Disclosed and transparent. Disclosure and transparency through all of these processes on reasoning and thought process and how decisions are made creates a virtuous cycle with the marketplace to determine and inform good decision-making and good behavior. And so this goes a long way to mitigating bias. It goes a long way to keeping human agency in the system. It goes a long way when you provide diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback, not at the end, but at the beginning, in the design, development, and risk assessment phase. These things are currently required in our audit criteria.
Okay, I hope everyone's charged their mugs or glasses or whatever with refreshments and had a bit of a break. I'd like to welcome Matt Gantley as well from UCAS, the CEO, and Paul has had to drop off. So welcome, Matt. So let's go to some audience Q&A.
Welcome. It's lovely to see you. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Matt. Let's go to some of the audience questions that we had while people were presenting their position and their organisation. What do panelists think are the biggest opportunities and challenges for transatlantic cooperation on these issues? Beyond a webinar like this, what are the opportunities and challenges that you see from your perspective? I'll start with you, Farahnaaz.
So I actually want to flip it. I think we've had tremendous opportunity, especially with our UK colleagues, our colleagues at the OECD. GAO is a member of the International Supreme Audit Institution. And through that global collaboration we have with over 140 partner countries, we have a unique opportunity to kind of talk across these emerging technologies, issues of big data, issues of science and technology, AI. We have working groups where we're planning to share our framework and also learning from our colleagues in India, in the Netherlands, in Germany. And so because of that InterSite platform, which is the Supreme Audit Institution space, GAO actually has actually benefited a lot from broader global collaboration. And we've been able to share learnings and best practices. So, we obviously look forward to other platforms as well, where we can learn and continue to move forward with a version 2.0 of the framework if that's needed. So I think there is a lot of strong global discussions currently happening when on the issue of AI.
Great. Does anyone else have any thoughts on opportunities and challenges for cooperation?
I think in my space, in the labor and employment space, it's critical because the technology that HR vendors that are creating this AI is being used not just here in the United States, but around the world. So I think it's very critical that we continue to have these discussions, and that because we're all at the forefront of either AI laws or regulations, when it comes to labor and employment, those discussions, and I've been having many discussions with academics, scholars, and officials from around the world of how do we actually do this right on the outset, because like I said, this technology is out there. It's being used here, the same technology is being used in the United States, and that's being used for large companies globally. So how do we get those best practices out there for the developers when they're designing this, to be mindful of not just our laws, but all the regulations relating to the ethical use of AI in employment?
Great. And there's several questions actually about the difference between developers of products and users, so an employer in your case, Keith. And how are we going to separate out those responsibilities of product developers being responsible and accountable for developing a system that is, for example, free from bias, and those of the end user in configuring, monitoring, and taking accountability for understanding how they're using that system in order to prevent issues like bias? How are you thinking about subdividing these responsibilities? Keith, do you want to go first?
Yeah, and this is a very interesting question, and one I get all the time. And I believe that, especially with the people involved in this industry from the engineering part of the AI, that if the EEOC says something regarding the proper use of AI related to the laws we administer and enforce, that the majority of these vendors, the ones at least in good faith that truly are trying to create ethical AI, are going to listen. So not going down the path of the legal analysis of jurisdiction over vendors for enforcement actions, but I look at everything we do here at the EEOC as twofold. One, as I said in my intro, we're a civil law enforcement agency, and we have to enforce these laws. So if there is discrimination being used, occurring by algorithms, then we're going to enforce it against those who are using it. But on the educational side, it is our mission to prevent any discrimination, and we do that through guidance and educational outreach. So to me, they go hand in hand because of our limited resources. So I truly believe that giving that guidance and saying, okay, here's when you're designing these AI, here's the laws that you need to take into account. I believe that will reach vendors, that will reach the people who are not necessarily questionably subject to our jurisdiction. I do believe in good faith that they are going to comply with that, because the people who are buying the software and the employers using it are going to demand that before they actually purchase it. So I think we can have a very large impact on everyone involved in being subject to this technology, from the employees to the employers buying it to the vendors creating it, through guidance and outreach.
Okay, and Hugh and Matt, maybe you've got some thoughts about other areas of certification where both the end user of the product and the product itself are required to be certified in some way. Does that exist in any other industries or contexts?
We're both thinking.
I suppose organizations.
Good question. I'm not too sure that there's many examples. I'm not going to go to the question before, actually. I'd have to ponder on that point further. But let me maybe turn the question around into where there is more example of this, and maybe it's linked back to your earlier question. Is accredited conformity assessment or accredited certification lends a huge amount of value to this arena. in a number of different ways. Firstly, because it's about consensus-based standards, standards that are developed based upon requirements from regulators, from industry, from users of those products or services, where the community comes together to create a consensus on what the appropriate requirements are. There could be bias within artificial intelligence, it could be food safety standards. The opportunity for consensus-based standards is huge, and it lends itself especially well to governance standards for artificial intelligence. Another major aspect of accredited certification is the development of certification bodies, and they are, of course, by their very nature, connected to the bodies of which they're assessing the product or the service. And so the accreditation body, which evaluates this certification body, makes sure that they're doing that competently, impartially, and consistently. And those, both accreditation and conformity assessment, are part of an international consensus-based framework of governance, ensuring that the whole process works together and holds together, making sure that those consensus-based standards are implemented properly, and there's a governance framework in place.
And there is a management system standard on AI systems, which from memory, I can't remember if it applies to users as well as, sorry, in development. From memory, I can't remember if it applies to users or just developers. I think it's both. So maybe we could see something where users of AI are being accredited against the management system, certified against the management system standard, and developers are being certified against specific technical standards, such as on bias. It will be interesting. Okay. Question on innovation.
I think in the way that you interpret it, I think there is. I was just thinking a little further on this user and developer piece. So the development of ISO 42000, which is the new management system standard, that's really just kicked off in terms of the application of artificial intelligence. I think that within its scope of coverage for the certification, it does cover both the development of that AI and then its ultimate use. So yeah, there is application for that.
Right. So just talking about, go on.
Sorry, no, I just wanted to add in, one of the points that our expert panel members noted was this notion of an appeals process, right? That from the user perspective, you need some documentation. One, you need a process for the user to be able to appeal based on their experience of the system. And then you need documentation and then correction or mitigation strategies. And that's something that the panel of experts that we convened thought was very, very important. And the way we capture it in the AI accountability framework is a practice around external stakeholder outreach, and the user community is key in that outreach and ensuring that if there are any issues that are raised throughout the implementation, the deployment of the system itself, that those are captured, corrected, and mitigated.
Got it. Okay, thank you. So moving on to innovation. So Keith gave some examples at the start of how AI can actually help remove cognitive bias in employers or people selecting candidates. And that's an example of how AI can be used innovatively and for good. But it is more complex than that, and there is still other types of bias that could be introduced. I mean, for example, you can never remove all of the bias. You always want to be biased towards people with PhDs when you're hiring for professors at a university. But you can't do much about the number of people with PhDs from different backgrounds that already exist within the available community. So the societal bias issues. There's also complex technical bias issues that are hard to detect. So, for instance, in the UK, we had an issue with the application form to join a university, the national UCAS application form, where natural language, not in terms of features, not in terms of specific data items, but just the style of writing of people from certain ethnic backgrounds was triggering their application to university to be more likely to go into the fraud pile. I don't know why people fraudulently apply for universities, I'm not sure, but apparently they do, and apparently there is a fraud detection algorithm. And nobody's really got to the bottom of that and understood that. Similarly, there's lots of complex areas in computer vision where we don't actually have the tools and techniques outside of R&D at a university to necessarily remove all the different types of bias. So we know that there's things we can't do. We know that we can't get it perfect. And we know that we want to support innovation, and we want to support things like startups. So it'd be really interesting in people's thoughts around how we manage the impact on innovation and SMEs as there are various initiatives around regulating AI starting to appear. It's a shame we haven't got Paul for this bit as well. So anybody got any thoughts on this topic?
In the HR technology space, they've been asking for regulation or guidance for a long time, and as I said in my speech in my intro about some of the benefits of AI in my space about removing that unconscious bias or the direct bias, I think that the more we can do here to give that guidance on how it applies to our existing laws, that's going to spur more innovation. And the more we can help the developers create this, being mindful of these complex federal anti-discrimination laws that we have in the United States, I think that will give them the certainty that they can create and develop new products to truly help eliminate bias and discrimination from the workplace. So from my perspective, in my space, and I know I'm narrow here, but I think that the more the EEOC can do here to help, again, those three groups, the employees who are being subject to this technology, the employers who are using it, and the vendors creating it, it's going to spur new developments, new products that ultimately will help achieve our goals.
And if I could jump in here, yeah, I mean, the notion of just continuous monitoring, right? That has to be our mitigation strategy. It's not if bias, it's when bias. This notion of unconscious bias can enter into the system at any point, just like in any non-AI space, it occurs. I think in the AI space, we just have to assume that it will occur consciously or unconsciously. So the continuous monitoring loop and being able to catch and have mitigation strategies, either stopping the model or the solution itself or the system itself, or noting that, okay, there was some inherent introduction of bias somewhere in the decision rule that we need to check on. But I think the if statement really needs to move to the when statement. And if I had my managing director on, he would say this is not unique to AI. People are biased. And we try to mitigate and manage that, especially in the government space, routinely through our D&I efforts. And so to assume that these computers, through the data that we've ingested, which is incomplete often, has inherent bias, the use of proxy variables that sometimes are not appropriate, the mitigation strategies for data management may not be appropriate. It's inevitable. So continuous monitoring really has to be our mitigation strategy.
And probably one to Hugh and Matt, that continuous monitoring, market surveillance, I mean, that's an existing part of certification within the UK, isn't it?
Well, it is up to a point, but I think traditionally, and in fact, Farahnaaz said something similar. We tend to have an annual audit. One of our non-executive directors is a guy
yes, across many different areas of.
Yeah, I was going to say one of our non-executive directors is a guy called Professor Michael Manelli, who's a very interesting American, although he's now based in London, and he is very involved in fintech. But he often makes the point to us, why do we do things on an annual cycle? We don't worship the planets anymore. This is not the Stone Age. What's so special about every 12 months? And I think with the development of AI and the use of data, we can go to continuous monitoring in a lot of areas. And we're not looking at a snapshot in time. We're looking at things averaged over rolling periods of 12 months or 24 months or since the beginning of the measurement. So it produces a different approach to things, which, as long as we set it up right, will give, you would think, better results.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to another question from the audience. Do the panelists have any strong opinions on the use of certain technologies? I mean, I think Paul outlined some kind of red lines, social monitoring, for instance. In particular, facial analysis, emotional analysis. are very, very contentious AI techniques. Do you have any views on these techniques and whether they should be outright banned?
Well, at least from the labor and employment space, for technologies that have been developed to monitor facial affects or analysis during the actual interview process. I know the state of Illinois has moved forward and discussed some of that. So you're seeing a patchwork of local laws addressing that, in some cases outright banning it. So, but from the EEOC's perspective, whether or not facial affects or the way your voice tone is during an interview or the words you say, whether or not that is going to determine whether you're the best employee or you're not a good employee or you're applicable for the job or not, is a little bit beyond our purview. But what is directly in our jurisdiction is whether that technology has a disproportionate impact on certain genders, race, national origin, or more importantly, people with disability. So somebody who has an accent, the speech recognition program may not be able to recognize them, opposed to somebody who speaks in perfect English. Or so for some of these facial recognition technologies, if somebody has a disability and doesn't know where to look, or they can't move their face, are they going to be given a lower score based on somebody who doesn't have that disability, which directly impacts the laws we administer and enforce here at the EEOC. So there's significant problems with those technologies when it comes to certain even genders or people of national origin. I know there's some, the MIT Gender Shades Project did a study on this facial recognition technology, and for white men, it was able to pick up 99% of white men, but for females, of darker skinned females, it was much lower, something like 65 to 75%. So, that inherently, if the computer can't even recognize you just based on the color of your skin, that's a tremendous issue for the EEOC. Then moving forward to what it's actually analyzing. So there's a lot of issues from the anti-discrimination law that related to either national origin, gender, or more importantly, or equally importantly, is disability discrimination. So a lot of issues for the EEOC on that.
Thank you. Farahnaaz, any thoughts?
Yes. So, no comments around banning any specific tech in particular, but the notion of facial recognition and federal implementation of facial recognition software. GAO just released a report 2 weeks back on some challenges associated, and I think the commissioner laid them out very well. And it really has to do with the training and the testing of the data, right? The model itself and the type of information, how the model learns when it comes to women versus men, light skin versus dark skin. That's really important, especially in government applications. But I don't think that we would ever say that there is any AI solution or a tech that is a yay or a nay. I think we leave that up to federal agencies to determine. But there are a lot of shiny tools out there. There are a lot of gadgets out there. But I think what the framework is asking federal implementers to think about is, well, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? And what is the clear goal and objective of using this technology versus traditional methods? What is new here? What is the traditional methodology or the traditional technology not helping you achieve that you want to use? You want to move to an AI solution. So that's really the approach that we would expect federal implementers to take.
That makes sense. I think computer vision in itself is a really interesting area when it comes to accuracy and bias, because first of all, there's no proxy variable. You can't hide how you look for computer vision, right? Your skin color is going to be there. Whether you're wearing makeup is going to be a factor, and that's a cultural factor as well. Whether you're a man or a woman, etc., and so many other factors as well. There are problems with
like disability.
Yeah, like disability. People sat down in a wheelchair. They aren't recognized necessarily as people or as obstacles to a self-driving car. And one of the problems that we have in trying to evaluate things like that is that, well, skin tone is one thing. You can kind of tell skin tone from an image programmatically, but finding all the different possible street scenes that could happen and things like that is really hard. And building up that test data set to even evaluate for some of these problems is really hard. And when I talk to computer vision companies who are doing things like street scene analysis or facial recognition, what they're finding is, whereas they used to have, in traditional software environments, a support team full of people who could turn servers on and off and solve customer tickets, they now have their most expensive data scientists sat monitoring on a continuous basis their production systems, coupled with other people in the ecosystem, maybe crowdsourced workers, even people in refugee camps who are labeling data to provide the ground truth that then allows the data scientists to evaluate the accuracy. So these are hugely complicated problems, and it's one thing to solve it with tabular data or loan data or financial services data. Some of these areas are really complicated. I don't know if, Farahnaaz, you dug into any of these complexities in your GAO report around areas where this is less studied.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe, and I just posted our facial recognition, federal implementation of federal recognition software in the chat box. I think one key area that we had, which we really flagged in the framework, is the use of diversity really in the designer, data scientist community. The labelers, those that are actually, looking at the characteristics and proxy variables need to be a diverse group of stakeholders. For instance, in our panel itself, our panel was 60% female and 40% with some minority ethnic origin. You need those types of stakeholders at the early design phase because you're just not going to catch some of these issues, especially in some of these softwares. It's not a function of being trained in D&I, it's a function of having that experience. For instance, something as small as we had a designer note that, well, we had a data set, we didn't want to identify any racial characteristics. So we used a proxy variable, we used zip codes. Now, understanding that zip codes inherently also have some demographic, right, socioeconomic elements attached, that you need some contextual domain expertise in variable selection that is just not from a method perspective. And so we raised the point, and I think our facial recognition software report also knows, is the notion of diverse recruitment and workforce skill sets from the designer community, the developer community, and then as well as policy experts. Adam, I don't know if I clearly addressed the question you were raising.
No, that's a great point. I think one of the questions we have actually is quite relevant to this, which is about organizations and their culture, including their diversity of those organizations. And by diversity, I'm referring to a multitude of different things, whether it's domain experience, perspectives. How do you ensure /audit /certify that an organization has appropriate diversity of thought and diversity of experience to be able to do that kind of work? That's really hard, isn't it? Does anybody have any answers for that?
Well, our AI framework definitely poses a series of questions, maybe not answers, but as auditors, we need to be asking, who was involved in the designer phase? What was their background? How aware were they on these issues of diversity, disparate impacts, ethics? So there are a series of questions, and from a training perspective, be it private sector or government, what type of training is actually provided to the developers and designer community, and how are you ensuring this throughout the AI lifecycle? Because even at the deployment stage, the operational environment can also introduce a lot of these biases. So it's not just during model development, but it's in the operational space as well. So there are a series of questions, and that's why the framework provides that, what the question is for the third-party assessor and the auditor to kind of get to this point.
What's your next steps with the GAO framework, Farahnaaz? It sounds like a lot of work has gone into it. How are you going to ensure its adoption across the target?
Yeah, well, I mean, just by my being here is one way we're getting the word out that this framework is out there. And for us, the work has just begun. Like I mentioned in my comments, the framework's very broad, and at the aggregate level, it's not use case specific. I think in our next phase, what we're looking for is feedback and more of a case study approach. For instance, Department of Transportation's application of autonomous vehicles. How would this framework be applied in that scenario? Or the criminal justice, if it's adjudication, or in the HR department, how is that process working? So I think we are looking for we're already thinking about our 2.0. version, which is going to be very use case specific, but we want feedback. I think we definitely want to put this framework to use, but we want our federal implementers, practitioners, the evaluations community to give us feedback, in terms of, is this practice, is it appropriate? Is the question correct? Is the audit procedure providing enough in terms of scope and methodology? And so that feedback is really critical to us. And I open this to this audience here as well, as you review the framework and you come across something that you think that we did not address or fully address, and that there's an opportunity for us to do that in our future work, please, we look forward to that feedback. Currently, we do have ongoing audits in AI in the US government within GAO. And so we're looking to applying our framework currently to our ongoing work and having some lessons learned as we think about next steps.
Great. Okay. So just to move on a little bit to the ecosystem. So I was going to say regulatory ecosystem, but I'm not going to say regulatory. I'm just going to say ecosystem. In terms of the ecosystem of what we all want here, which is achieving AI systems which are good for humanity, what do you think the opportunities are for different skill sets to be developed or different organizational structures? Obviously, a lot of people here will be part of ForHumanity, which has a certain view on audit of AI systems. But what do you think the missing players are? Maybe it's third-party assessment companies, maybe it's consultancies to help get the data science right, maybe it is more certification schemes. It's a question to everybody. What do you think the gaps are in the ecosystem that might need to be filled? Anyone? For instance, Hugh, do you have all of the accredited bodies that you need?
If I could jump in there first,
yeah,
Adam. I think you've almost answered the question yourself. It's all of those points for.
So lots of skills and third parties, because this is what I see. I see the data science.
Sorry, there's quite a significant time lag, I'm afraid, in this session. So, yep, I think Adam, you mentioned it before. There's in all aspects of of what you mentioned, for a scheme to be really successful. Yes.
So lots to create. I know within the EU they're talking about having sort of a notified body in each state that has overall authority and oversight, and then creating a series of certification bodies that kind of report certifications into that. The US approach seems a lot more light touch in terms of the regulatory approach. But is Farahnaaz or Keith, do you see any missing actors in the ecosystem at the moment?
This is a tougher one for me to answer from my approach as a government official. All I can say is that we appreciate all the outside interest in this. We appreciate that people are coming together to create groups like this to be able to get the conversation going, to include us. And I think I speak on behalf of both of us as regulators to be a part of it in this conversation. And the fact that there is so much interest is really what we like to see, and that people are out there caring about these issues that will help us, as we both either make regulations or if there's new laws or any kind of guidance, to have that public input is extremely valuable. That's why in the rulemaking process here in the United States, there's a notice and comment period where people can submit comments, and we have to look at the agencies. We look at those, every single one of the comments, whether they're for what the agency wants to do, or totally against, or just completely critical or complimentary. We have to look at every single comment. So the more people engage in all process relating to regulation, it, for me, is a very good thing, and I appreciate not just ForHumanity, but everyone on this call's interest in doing that and helping us as we move forward with whatever these various agencies are going to do. I think that interest from the outside is really what makes it critical, because ultimately these are going to be the rules, regulations, laws that are going to be enforced, and that people here are going to have to live with. So the more interaction in that process is a very good thing, and I thank everyone for being on this call today.
Thank you. Okay, I've got two more audience questions I think we can try and cover off before the end. The first one is quite interesting. How can we, or should we, improve on public disclosure to drive forward transparency and accountability in AI systems and their use? Certainly at the moment, I feel that's very limited where I am in Europe. What do you think, Farahnaaz?
So, and I mentioned this earlier, I think when we spoke to our panel experts, they thought that really the appeals process and transparency in terms of the development of the system should definitely be something that implementers think about. But I'm also clearly aware that in the classified space, so one of the early, I would say, more matured agencies in the federal government right now using AI is the Department of Defense. And I could imagine that there are some spaces that may not be appropriate and may not lend to the level of transparency that the public would like to see. So I think with that said, definitely documentation is key here, especially from a third-party assessment, be it classified or unclassified spaces. And in terms of the stakeholder community, ensuring the users of the system are included from the early, life cycle perspective are some key ways. I do want to also make one more comment about transparency. Transparency for AI solutions is not a constant. If it's a medical technology where the tool is, providing some diagnostics, if you have cancer or not, yes, you want some transparency in how the algorithm came to that decision. If it's a tool that is, telling you make a right turn at the next signal, it's an autonomous vehicle of sorts, I'm not sure you need all the transparency on how the tech made that determination. So even the level of transparency in terms of which sector the system is being used at would naturally vary.
That leads in very nicely to the other question I had, which is about explainable AI, because of course transparency is a wider topic. We have concepts of documentation, which forcing people to write documentation so it can be audited is always good in my eyes. But that kind of dynamic explainability is, and there are many dimensions of explainability, whether it's local, global, whether it is something that's comprehensible to the user or comprehensible to the operator. Do you think that people should be encouraged to invest in making sure their AI systems are explainable? And I'll ask you, Keith, because I know you've got to run in a second.
Yeah, and thank you, and I appreciate that. And I've called, at least for the explainability, I've started discussing that in the impact it has in the results, right? So not necessarily just talking about the transparency of what the AI code is yet, which is beyond my knowledge base of how it actually works. I understand maybe the data set that goes in and the results, but taking a look at the results, I've really, I've publicly said that employers who are using AI technology should really press the vendors for details, and helpful questions that I think that should be asked right now are, what type of statistical analysis do the vendors perform to test for impact on the discrimination side under our laws? How did they choose those methods? Why do you think that they are the right method in that case? What were the results of the analysis, and how do you do you retest, and how do you retest for impact as the training data changes or grows? So that's what I'm calling for, that at least in the HR space, that employers who are buying this technology ask the vendors for. And a lot of vendors have very good answers to these, and they can actually point to the statistical tests they're using. So it doesn't necessarily get into the coding algorithm part of it on transparency. It's the results, which we all see, and how did you get to those results? How did you test them to make sure that they're not discriminating against the law? So, at least for now, that has been my public calling on pushback on the data. How did you get there? How is it, statistically, how does that work? Which I think will be very illuminating for a lot of people who are really looking into this space.
I think that's a really important thing to try and achieve. Obviously, from the point of view of somebody like ourselves, it makes our life a lot easier. But more importantly, it just helps build up the trust and confidence in these systems, because we're all having to take on trust what happens in the algorithm or in the black box. And I think the more openness there is, and an agreed situation that, vendors, for instance, have to be open about that. I think is very important. By the way, I'm apologising on Matt's behalf. He's having so much lag problem. He's decided to leave the answers to me, but he apologises that despite the fact that we're talking about advanced AI systems, we're struggling with basic telecommunications.
Great. Okay, so I think we've kind of come to a natural end to the questions. So I guess, does anybody want to make any final points?
I actually have to run a little early, so I will conclude. Thank you so much for the time today. Again, thanks to ForHumanity, Ryan and Adam for putting this together, and everyone else involved. I really appreciate all the support you've given me as I ventured into looking at AI in the HR space. And let's keep the conversation going. I really need, as I said in my opening, let's work together on how we could provide guidelines for everyone to be able to use AI responsibly and ethically, and especially on the vendor side, and how can we communicate in a language to the vendors who may not be lawyers, who may not be ethicists or computer scientists, to understand the long existing laws here in the United States and how we can develop AI with that in mind so it can be used properly. So please reach out to me in my office. I'm happy to take additional comments or concerns as we move forward in discussing this very important topic. And again, thank you all for having me.
Thank you very much. Anybody else, any final comments?
Yeah, I'd like to just echo, I want to thank Ryan and his team at ForHumanity for this platform. And again, just my pitch again, that if you, once you have a chance to look at the AI accountability framework, if you have any feedback, if you have any thoughts or comments, we really welcome that. Even though it's not a public comment period, we want to make sure that we have the implementer, the practitioner's perspective. So if there is any feedback or any case study approaches, if you've used the framework or you plan to use the framework in your own application spaces, we really welcome that learning as well. And it's really been a pleasure to have this conversation this morning.
Thanks for joining us, Farahnaaz. Hugh, any final thoughts?
Just to echo those, I think it's been a very interesting session. It's great to get views from different places around the world. We're all grappling with the same problems, and I think the more we can cooperate and collaborate, the better. So thanks to ForHumanity for creating the platform where we can do that.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the audience for listening and for your questions as well. That's been great. I'm sure you'll all be on to the next session now. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
What is an infrastructure of trust? An infrastructure of trust is designed to help the public, help a party that has no ability to get into the details to know and feel confident that a set of audit rules